but God has always been there. I think that's where a lot of the things that you've been saying, God has always been taking care of you, which is awesome. And it's always a massive encouragement to other people to be hearing that as well.
Yep.
But we'll continue doing that.
We will.
This is part one.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
But we'll wrap this up. We'll wrap these chips up.
Yeah.
And we'll be back with Michael at some point. All right, let's go. You ready? Sometimes starting. Welcome back, everyone, to the Chip Lunch podcast. Tim's just been hitting me, so I had to start the podcast, so we had to get him, so he's not on camera hitting me. But it is nice to welcome Tim as a guest host on the podcast. I cannot believe it. Ethan and Braden are studying the Bible.
I know.
And
outrageous.
Outrageous. That's why they're not here at Bible College. And it is my pleasure, as always, to welcome him back. As always? We can say as always.
Yeah, sure.
Welcome back, Michael, to the podcast for your part two.
Part two.
Yeah. And what I'm excited about is, first of all, you're wearing a very interesting shirt that says, "I am older than the internet."
That's right.
Do you have a number of shirts that are like this?
Presents that people buy for me, family especially, seem to be shirts like this. And the really interesting side result of that is when I go for my evening walks around Revesby.
Right.
You know, people would normally be head down. You know, it's 7 o'clock at night. You're out for a walk. You don't look at anyone. Don't engage. You know, none of that. People actually smile at me. And for a while, I was wondering, like, have I got something in my teeth or something like that? And then I realised, they're all reading my T-shirt. I'm older than the internet.
Wow. So you bring the community together.
Shirts are bringing people and community together. Yeah.
Are the shirts all in this, the older than theme? Like, I'm older than and then you have different markers?
They're the dad pun ones, you know?
Okay,
Sure. So I've got a shirt that basically says, "You don't scare me." I've got 2 daughters.
Yep.
Yeah. So, that one, those kind of things, yeah.
But you said that people keep buying them. Is that because you keep wearing them?
Maybe they think I don't have a good taste in fashion.
Or it's just like an easy fallback. It's just like, I'll just buy Dad one of those shirts. What can we find on the internet this time?
Yeah, well, we're all like that, aren't we? We find something a family member might like. My wife tells the story of her nana liking elephants, and then for every year afterwards, people would buy, things of elephants, and it just became like, does she really like elephants? No one can think of anything else. So just have this.
It became elephantine.
That's right.
Wow.
Geez, there every Christmas going, another elephant. Thanks. Yeah, great.
It's bigger than the last one.
That was a 6-month interest that I had. It's been going for 10 years.
I know.
So how many elephants do you have then? Do you have to you might eventually have to get a real elephant.
Yes, that's it. How do you trump?
Oh,
yes. How do you?
Yeah, that would
beat
be
those ones. Yeah.
That would be interesting if you ended up having the only way is up, and the only way is to get a full-on elephant.
The Homer Simpson episode. He's the elephant. He's an elephant. Yeah, it's one of the early episodes.
Yes,
and then he has to take it back to the the park because it's lonely.
I was thinking of the one where he gets a lobster and then makes it a bath and accidentally cooks it.
No, I think it's a different one.
Yeah, I forget. He's got a name for it, like not crabby. Anyway, we'll move on from that. You bought a prop.
I did.
Because I'm very excited to discuss.
Oh, well, because we were talking about books and talking about favourites, and I mentioned the Boy Biggles. I don't know if that can be seen there on the camera and stuff, but I brought this along because actually there's a really good quote in it that helped me, particularly sort of like during my teen years and stuff as well. And I mean, we can push into this a bit later, but I've always found that reading and particularly fiction has been really helpful for me as I kind of process feelings and emotions and give me understanding of the world. And this was one of those quotes that kind of stick with you as well. So
I'm keen to read that a bit delve later into that now, because Tim and I discuss reading a lot. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, well, and then Tim's just
launched a book.
Published a book, yeah.
It's not It's not my podcast.
That's all right.
Yeah,
It's mine.
That's it. Well,
it's yours.
Yeah, I've decided.
Cross-platform plugging.
Cross-platform.
Of
Yeah,
other,
that's right.
I've decided that you're allowed to.
Okay.
Yeah.
I published a book.
Yeah. Again, you say what it is.
It's called The Child in God's Church.
Yes.
Available from youthworksmedia.net. And it is about if we theologically believe that this is what a child is and we theologically believe this is what the church is, what happens when you put that child into that church? Well, you therefore get, and I argue you should have good age specialist ministries that cater for their developmental stage. You should have good family ministries, so the church should be actively engaged in equipping the household for faith. And thirdly, you should be having good intergenerational relationships so that the children are not only in their age specialist ministries, but integrated into the whole church. And so you're trying to find ways of expressing all three of those. And my argument's basically, if you can hold those three in tension and find different ways of expressing each, then that's going to help form the faith of children.
Amazing. You did really well of summarising that. Well done.
I thought a lot about it.
Yeah, because you've been on the podcast promotion tour, haven't you?
Oh, I've done one. Yeah.
You don't stop selling yourself short. You should have just said yes.
Yes. All the podcasts.
All the podcasts.
Yeah. Next week, Joe Rogan.
Oh,
Yeah, he's
excellent.
asked me
Look
to come
forward
on.
to that. Yep.
Yep. And then Jordan Peterson.
Jordan Peterson.
Yep.
And then you're going to do like the Trump campaign did, Theo Von. And
All those ones I haven't heard of yet.
Still, you're going to promote the book. Anyway, returning back to reading though.
Oh, look, that was very impressive, Tim.
Yeah.
I mean, I love the reference to household of faith because I think, the images of the church, are far more grand and wonderful. They appeal to our imagination. And the household, one of those images that's picked up by Paul to Timothy, it is just a fantastic way of thinking about that and having that generational. It's
a hard word.
That one, yes, yeah.
Yep.
Old and young, basically. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. And I think, this is much more of a sort of shock absorber conversation than a chip lunch, but
we're crossing over.
I think coming out of sort of a seeker-sensitive movement, that church became very much an event. And so part of, I think, the key to good church community, which we're all about, that's our Revolve Church, and part of that is intergenerationality, is this recapturing that vision that church is not an event that I attend. It's a family, it's a household, it's a body of Christ that I'm a part of. And if we can recapture that, then I think that's going to help us. It helps with all sorts of problems, like, do I miss church for a week, or I can just catch up online, or, I can be a Christian by listening to a sermon podcast and a Spotify playlist on the beach by myself, and all of those issues that we have and questions that we have, I think large part can be solved if we recapture that idea of no, the church is a household of faith. It's a family. It's a group of friends who love Jesus and love each other, and that it's harder, it's messier than an event. It's easy to pull off an event. It's harder to pull off a family meal. Yeah, but that's what we're doing. So absolutely.
Yeah. And that event, if you like, that coming together, that gathering, brings that sense of belonging that is there in the household.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah.
I haven't got my copy of the book
why not?
yet. Well, because you haven't sent me one.
He's given you a really good.
I'll send you one so
free
you can
signed
promote
copy.
it on the podcast.
Yeah, I'll do it.
He's given you a really good elevator pitch, though.
That's right.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, he's
that's
done absolutely.
You don't need to read it now. That's all it is.
Well, good.
It's just that in
I was going to ask
30,000
ChatGPT.
words, something 30,000 words.
Is it?
40,000? I don't know. I can't remember.
That's a lot of writing, though.
That's what my daughter said. She flicked through it and she looks and goes, "Did you write all of this?" And I'm like, yeah. She goes, "That must have been exhausting."
And you're like,
Yeah,
this
it was
is what
actually,
Daddy does.
He does.
So
I'm a
I'm
writer
tired
now.
all the time.
It must feel good to know that you have a book.
It's nice that it's
you've
out in the
published
world.
yourself.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Should we move back to
We should move on to the
Yeah, look,
actual
I mean,
genesis of this topic?
So maybe just to kind of segue.
Yeah.
Captain W.E. Jones, the author of Biggles, probably wrote more than 40,000
Yeah.
words of Biggles over the period of time and stuff.
He's got a few more books to his name.
Yes.
He does, yeah. I mentioned one of my favourite, the Boy Biggles, and there's like a really good quote there. And the interesting thing, of course, is that this character Biggles that we're introduced to, we are first introduced to him as a pilot during the First World War. Yeah. That's where most people enter into the story.
He's like 16, 17, right?
Yeah. And so you don't know too much of sort of the background story. You're kind of like, well, what formed this guy? And the Boy Biggles is sort of the author's attempt on doing that. Yeah. And he tells a number of stories of him growing up in India, where his father was working, and his adventures in the jungle. And so, he's this boy facing these elements, animals, wild animals, and other experiences like what he would face, in a similar way, facing something that's frightening and an enemy like he's going to face in the skies above France during the First World War. Yeah. And there's this great quote that's stuck with me. The book is just a collection of short stories, and one of them is called A Test of Nerve. And in the story, Biggles goes out with a man called the Skipper, who is basically tasked with shooting a tiger that is attacking people in the village. And the way that they do that is they have a goat that acts sort of like the lure for the tiger, the bait, and they sit up on top of a platform up in the tree, and they wait for the tiger to come for the goat, and that's when they're going to shoot them. But the Skipper has been under some health issues, and he has this medication with him, and he leaves his haversack back in the village, and so he climbs up to the top. They're sitting up there up at the top, and then the tiger comes along, and Biggles realises that the Skipper is undergoing what we might say health emergency, really, and he needs to take his tablets, but the tablets are back in the village.
Yep.
And so the Boy Biggles basically climbs down, and in the darkness where there's this man-eating tiger, he makes his way back to the village. And the village is like completely closed off to him. People won't let him in. They're deeply afraid. And he barges in, and he gets the medication, and he goes back. And when he comes back, he sees something, and he throws this lighted torch at it and then hastens back up the top, kind of thing, and then gives the tablets to the Skipper. And basically the story sort of is picked up where the Skipper, having the medication kind of sort of kick in, says in a curious thought, as if it had just struck him, said, "The pills, where were they?" Biggles replies, "In your haversack." How did they get here?" "I fetched them." A pause, as if the meaning of this was sinking home. "Do you mean you've been to the village?" asked the Skipper incredulously. "Of course." "Oh my God. If your father ever learns I let you do that, he'll shoot me." "You didn't let me," corrected James cheerfully. "You didn't know anything about it. I shan't tell him if you don't." "Did you see the tiger?" "No, but he was there. I shoot him off by throwing a torch at him." Skipper made a queer noise in his throat. "So you shoot off a man-eater?" A little later, in a voice that was fast gathering strength, he went on, "Let me tell you something, James. If you live to be 100, you'll never do a braver thing than what you did tonight. And I know what I'm talking about. I don't regard myself as a coward, but I wouldn't have gone down those steps for all the treasures in India, not even with a rifle." "What else would you expect me to do?" protested James. "Now let me tell you something. If I am ever more frightened than I was this night, I doubt if I live to tell the tale. I was petrified. When your torch packed up on me, I really thought I'd die." And this is the quote that sort of stuck with me. He goes on to say, "That's the real test of courage, James," said the Skipper seriously. "It's easier for a man who doesn't know the meaning of fear to be brave. It's the man who is afraid but faces up to it who deserves a royal salute. Such men are gold, pure gold. Now tell me what happened."
Wow.
I mean, yeah, for me, in my youth, that was a hugely powerful thing, along with many other things, God's word as well. But that was a quote that really stuck with me, particularly as I tried to make my way through teenage years, dealing with the loss of my own brother, what that meant, suffering that I saw, hurts, pain, my own sense of place in the world as well. And it's very easy, I think, for fears to come and take over us and to feel like it's a tsunami, a huge wave coming towards us. But the real courage is not running away from that. The real courage is realizing that, yes, fear is natural, fear is understandable, but bravery is seen in actually facing it. And few are sometimes the people who do that. Few are those who push into it. So we made a real shift from silly to quite serious there, didn't we?
No, and I actually enjoyed it. I was actually just enjoying the story as well. I was just sitting back listening to an audiobook. But I was going to ask you though, what you're saying there makes sense. But you also said that fiction has become more of a thing for you throughout your life to help you process things. Like, tell us more about that. Like, what you got any examples or books that have really helped you besides Biggles?
Yeah. So, all of us have a story, and that's what you're doing here in this podcast.
That's right. Yeah.
People are telling their story, and one of the wonderful things about the kind of work that I've been able to do in ministry is being able to connect with people either through my story or for what I think as a Christian is God's bigger story. And if we're talking about sort of fiction and the place that it's had in my life, fiction and the storytelling has been a way of seeing how humans can kind of interact in various different circumstances. For me, it's actually fed a part of who I am, my imagination. Now, I realise as I have this conversation with different people that maybe I'm kind of wired differently from others. For example, if I listen to or if I read something written by Tim Keller, I read those words in my head as if Tim Keller is saying them.
Yep.
I read, something that might be sort of said by a politician who's known on the news in that regards. And quite interestingly, I read a Facebook post of a friend, and it was like I was reading it in his voice.
In their voice.
And not everyone necessarily has that aspect and has that part where the brain can fill in and make those things there. For me, imagination has been a powerful thing for trying to understand myself and the world. And I think that's one of the ways that God has wired myself. And stories being told, fictional or even biographical, have helped me to be able to enter into that. Because most authors, when they write a fictional story, are really either writing out of experience or writing out of a sense of wanting to shape a world in the way that they see that. They want, if they write a story about cowboys overcoming injustices, part of it is a way of wanting to overcome injustices that are in our world. And that's been a really helpful thing for me to process and connect with the emotions and feelings that are inside of me. But I think also, if we look at it from a Christian perspective, the biblical stories have that same power, but even more so because they're actually rooted in tangible physical history. So the story of Jesus overcoming death and rising from the grave is a powerful thing that appeals to our imagination. And I think this is something like Jordan Peterson has done in his work, seen how the story appeals to us as humanity. But one area where maybe he falls short, if I can say it this way, is it's actually concrete. This is Jesus incarnate in flesh coming amongst us. And so the Christian story even impacts us more so because this is the ultimate story, the one that the Creator God brings us into. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I'm just wondering, when you read the Bible, do you read it in Jesus' voice?
I haven't got a recording of that in my head.
Exactly.
But my daughter did say, she said, you do have a Jesus voice when you do the Bible readings.
That's cool.
Yeah, it's that, yeah.
Yeah, right.
So
as you go through life,
have there been any other fiction books that have really impacted you in terms of besides the Bible? Sorry, I meant to sound like the Bible.
No.
I'm saying the Bible's fiction. It's not fiction. But
look, I mean, there's stories that I connect to at times, and I suppose there's the stories that I read before I became a Christian that were trying to help me. That I think their importance was helping me to kind of connect into a bigger story, and maybe help me to understand my own story. And that obviously continues. You know, we want to kind of understand who we are, and stories is a great way of doing that. Along the way, becoming a Christian, stories that I've written have helped me to see how other people may perceive and view the world. And what they've done is they've either acted as a kind of additional illustrative thing to the Bible story, either maybe in a way that kind of contrasts to the Bible story, or maybe in a way in which the author is putting forward things not in a Christian framework, but still kind of telling things that Christians can kind of relate to. So as I said, I've deep dived into cowboy fiction. Mainly, I think, just because one struggle has been justice and injustice in the world. And here's a common repeating kind of theme. And one thing I think also in those cowboy novels is they kind of display power and humanity in the one as well. They're not a superhero in the sense of having these mystical, marvelous powers. They are just human people taking on injustice. And so what's happened for me in those stories is a connection to bringing that back into the Christian story. And so then to relate this into ministry perspective, you know, when I meet with families and hear their stories, what's happening inside of me is that similar kind of connection. You know, how does what they're saying about their loved one relate to what I hear in the bigger Christian story?
And it's interesting, like I'm just observing my children, that with them, they read a lot as well. And I read a lot when I was a kid as well. And just reflecting on what you're saying there, it really does help you make a bit more sense of the world, I think, through like using your imagination. So it's just putting those two kind of pieces together makes me think, oh yeah, it makes me understand what you're saying as well. Like that's what you've seen happen. So then if we go back to kind of a more chronological order of your story, we talked a lot. I think I was saying it's been a bit of a gap since we last recorded, and I think we finished last episode talking about how you're ministering in a different context with lots of multicultural, lots of people from different backgrounds. One of my questions was, how did you get to that point? So how did you end up becoming a minister in Revesby, where there is that large, you're probably ministering to a lot of different people there, perhaps people you've never ministered to before. How did you get to being that point as a pastor? I guess you did study to begin with? Yeah. So where did you end up doing that? And then how did you make your way to Revesby?
Yeah. So I think a good way of doing this, sort of talking about this, is in terms of that story, because looking now back, I see, as we talked about last time, God's hand watching over. Shane Warne used to say about some of his exploits as a bowler, no scriptwriter could have written this. And I have at times marveled at God's hand and watching over various different parts of life and working in that. And so part of what we discussed last time and what we're talking about here, how did that story kind of unfold? Well, there's parts like being in a multicultural place. God gave me a real heart for missions at a very young age, through actually the story of William Carey. Our church that I was attending did a play on the life of William Carey, and I scored the part of playing the young William Carey. And probably
the young Biggles.
reading Biggles and having all those India stories and everything along those lines. That that there it was formative. That was part of how God watched and worked over in that part.
Do you want to give the short version of William Carey, just for people listening in, just to give
Yeah.
some context?
Because that will help me.
Yeah, so William Carey was a cobbler. He was worked repairing shoes, and while he was repairing shoes, he would pore over Bible and scriptures, and he saw in the scriptures God's desire for us as Christians to be witnesses to the world around us, and he thought about those in places who had never heard the gospel. Thinking about like Romans, how will they hear unless someone goes and tells them? And he was really the father of what we would call the modern mission movement, in that desire to see the gospel go out sort of really, I wouldn't say it started with him, because obviously Christians had been doing that, but for the English-speaking world at that point in time, there weren't mission agencies like we did today, and he was the kind of founder of that. And so he went to India. He struggled through a whole bunch of things. Lost his first wife and children, had most of his work destroyed in a fire, didn't see little in the way of impact in a kind of time frame that we would kind of think. But God's unfolding story in him continued. And as I said, he had a massive impact in terms of people, particularly in English-speaking countries, seeing Christians in English-speaking countries seeing that we needed to take the gospel out. Yeah, and so I played that period of Carey's life where he was actually struggling to tell the church back in England that this is what Christians needed to do, and people were going, well, look, if God wanted the heathen to be rescued and saved, he would do it without you. He's got his ways of doing that, and Carey came up with that phrase based around Romans, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. And so, again, that story kind of impacted upon me as a
similar to stepping into the fear, like you were saying.
Sorry,
that's the only thing I was just thinking. Really putting those two things together, like the stepping into the fear and courage, is really what William Carey was doing too.
Yeah.
Sorry, please continue. It was a good wrap up. So, did that story inspire you?
Yeah, it did. I think I mentioned about having a youth group leader who was involved in Bible college, and that was a mission Bible college, and so I went and trained there. And I would have said that I would have gone to Greenland, I would have gone to Mongolia, I would have gone anywhere. Definitely, it was like adventure, and I think the imagination of being something like Biggles was going to be there, and possibly youth can bring a kind of zeal and thing of like, I can do this, and I can do this. Like, God is asking me to do this, and I can do this, and God's there in the midst, but he's only really there to kind of, for me to ask and support when I kind of need it, and not that maybe as you're going through these things, God's wanting us to realize you always need to be dependent and supported on him. And so, some of the unraveling experiences of my story were going to places like the year that we spent in Niger, and realizing the problem that humanity faces is far deeper and greater in sin and its effects, and the pain that is in this world is something that I can't resolve. I can't fix this. And all I can do is bring that message of the gospel to the people that God brings along my path. As a young boy, maybe thinking about that, Kerry, I would have thought I could have been that person who could go on and preach to, a crowd of 100,000 or something along those lines, and, seen revival or anything else. They're great stories that God wants us to connect with. That has been the case in human history, that there have been times when God has worked through individuals. But the normative thing, I believe the scripture says to us, is that it often happens in very simple small units like in households, in local churches, in places where, our people outside might say, well, that looks insignificant, but it actually does significant work because people connect with others through that.
Yeah, I think that's... Sorry, I just like listening to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So often I'm not prepared with a question. But
That's good.
So that's what kind of made you decide, like, I want to... Sorry, I just want to... Where did you say you went on a mission trip?
So we went to Niger in West Africa.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so we spent a year there. I mean, I think I mentioned this last time, we went to, after finishing Bible college, we went to a number of different mission agencies and said, look, could we explore what it might mean to work with you? And by that stage, I'd done some studies in IT. And so we thought, well, maybe I could use that. I didn't have any theological training apart from the Bible college. And all of these agencies wrote back and said, yeah, we can use you. We kind of put it out as a fleece moment, like, tell us, Lord, which one's going. And we ended up going out with Love Europe, Operation Mobilisation. Love Europe is a sort of a summer intensive 6 weeks in Europe, working with the local church doing evangelism, and a really great time. But we came back from that going, we're not sure whether that's the place that God would have us to go. And again, through God's working, as I said in the story before, he took us to Niger in West Africa, and we spent a year there.
Yeah.
And that year, look, I think I was growing by that sense. I wasn't going, I'm going to do this year and I'm going to impact this place. I went with a sense of, I want to know if this is something, God, you want us to go into long term, but we want to be in a place long enough that our experience is authentic, that we're deep, it's true, and we want to be able to engage enough with the culture that we just don't have this, tourist kind of experience. We actually have a deep sense.
Yeah.
And that year in Africa really impacted. When I was listening to the podcast with my daughter Kezia, she came to that bit and she said, oh, that's the thing, Dad, that's made me want to go and do missions as well. And then in the podcast, like, we paused it at that moment, and 3 minutes later in the podcast, I said exactly that same thing. So that was pretty awesome cool. that she herself articulated that.
Yeah.
What did you learn about yourself, and what did you learn about God in that year on mission?
What did I learn about myself? Trying to kind of there's so many different things that you learn. Look, I'll probably relate this story. This is probably an easy one to share something that I learned that's had an impact upon me. We were talking about sugary drinks beforehand. Okay, so when we were in Africa, we could never really kind of trust the water supplies, and what was something that you could trust was a bottle of Coke, because that had been, produced in a factory, and so it was going to be hygienic and stuff like that. And of course, the sugar content was going to do that. Now, if you're in a hot climate that you're sweating all of the time and you're dehydrating, a way of rehydrating yourself is not by drinking bottles of Coke.
Yeah.
And so I learned something about the human body, which is that if you replace your fluid intake, your water intake with Coca-Cola, it's not going to do your kidneys well. And so I had no major kidney issues, except I experienced kidney stones because I'd been drinking all of these carbonated drinks and not hydrating with water. And so it got to the point where I was trying to take some medication for the pain that I was experiencing. And the nurse from our organisation who gave me the medication, I was putting it in my mouth, and I just like vomited over the top of it. And, it was like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm feeling like all this shame, but also feeling like, I'm dying in this pain and everything. And people tell me that kidney stones are as painful as childbirth, which I don't know. Can't say what childbirth is like, but I don't want to go through that again. And as I said, so I learnt something about the human body, and I learnt something of my own sort of fragility. And this worked out in an interesting way. I was 25 when we were in Africa, and it struck me mainly because of my imagination. Life has its thirds, and when I turned 25, it was like, a third of my life has gone by, and it seems so quick, and there's 2/3 ahead of me. What am I going to do? How am I going to make an impact and a difference? And I remember speaking to someone there who was turning 50 at the time. Laughed at me like you still got lots of life sort of ahead of you. Here I am having this existential crisis kind of stuff because I'm turning 25, and I realised, life goes by really quickly. There's this kind of fragility. And the interesting thing about wearing this shirt, I'm older than the internet, is that I'm actually turning 50 this year. And I don't have that same existential kind of crisis, but it's something of an interesting thing that God has pushed a button, if you like. God's pushed at this point in time to say, life has its fragility to it. Our days are like the grass in the field. The wind goes over it, it is gone, and its place will know and no more, as Isaiah tells us. My experience in Niger, whether it be through suffering kidney stones, whether it be having this existential crisis at the age of 25, or whether it be just looking around and going, the medical, the things of life that are just normative here in Australia. You get sick, you get a cold, you go to the doctor, you get medicine, you suffer any kind of injury, there's a hospital, all of that is there. We have this motto of we can overcome stuff that life brings up. You just realise in a place like Africa that there's a whole level more of fragility to human life.
Right.
And then you also realise that maybe that is not actually something to have, that the foundation that we put ourselves, like we've got prosperity and therefore we've got support. Well, that's actually something we're building for ourselves. It's not being built on a foundation, not being built on a rock. It can actually be just as much a sand that we're building on rather than a rock.
Does that include what you learn about God as well?
Yeah. So I think the experience there showed me that God deeply has a heart for all peoples. It taught me, as I said about myself and about the church, we in the church in the West can't see ourselves as being superior. And it also taught me that God is just wonderful in how he brings people to himself. So there was an encounter, there's a period of time in the year around a feast known as Tabaski, where the predominantly Muslim population in Niger would sacrifice a goat or a cow or a sheep, and they'd actually kind of barbecue them, and they would sort of spread them out on these sticks. And when it was cooking, it was this fantastic smell. But when the when the animals were sacrificed, the blood would just be running over all of the ground. And I remember seeing that and thinking, here is a group of people who were worshipping, not I believe, but the true and living God. But this blood that's been spilt over the soil, that just spoke to my both imagination, but the Christian story as well, and just reminded me of the cost of what it was for Jesus to redeem and to rescue his people. So there was I think stories in life have often helped me to unpack, as I said, not only God's story as it relates to me, but God's character, in that it peels back some of maybe the initial simplicity that we have about who God is and his work, and actually reveals more details about it. So that, it's just not Jesus died for me, but Jesus died to rescue the whole world. He died for people in places like in Niger.
You always got like being of that sacrifice, like an Old Testament picture of what they actually did all the time.
Yeah.
As part of the Israelites were doing it. That's really interesting. So then we go from Niger, sorry, I couldn't pronounce that correctly.
Yep.
How do you become, what's the story of becoming a pastor now? I'm trying to fill in the gaps between you saying you're almost 50 now and you're a pastor. How did you get to that point?
So when we came back, we thought about, will we go back to Africa? And our desire was, yes, that's what we would like to do. And so we thought, well, what do we need if we're going to go back there long term? And we both thought that we needed to do further study. And so for Amanda, she did a Bachelor of Visual Arts, my wife Amanda, and she intention was to probably look at becoming an art teacher and doing that. And I was working, and then basically the opportunity came up for me to do theological studies. And I thought, I've done Bible college, but if I wanted to go to Africa, I'd probably like to be working with people I didn't want to go back to Africa just to do IT. I wanted to kind of work with the church, and I thought it'd be great to work with local pastors planting churches.
Right.
And for that, I thought, well, I probably need more theological training than what I've got at the moment. And so that's when I applied for Trinity Theological College in Perth and studied there and did my Bachelor of Theology. And the idea was that maybe I would go into pastoral ministry after some period of time in the mission field. Like, I think my idea was go and spend 20 years on the mission field, come back when your kids need education for university, and at that stage, you'll be able to take all of those experiences and pastor in a church here in Australia. As I said in my story last time, God then moved me from sort of that mission focus to having a pastoral ministry in a Baptist church. And from there, he used the mission connection that I had to bring me over to Revesby Congregational Church, because a colleague that worked with that missions agency that we were with had been a congregational minister, and he knew Revesby and they knew him. And so when I applied for the position, that was that God-ordained connection, if you like.
Yeah. And what's theological study like in Trinity. In Perth?
Yeah. So I don't think people here in Sydney realise the impact that some of our brothers and sisters in other denominations, ourselves, Sydney Anglicanism has had. And if you do know about Anglicanism in Australia, then Western Australia is probably, particularly Perth Diocese, is probably about as opposite from Sydney Diocese as you can get. And so to have some of lecturers in our college environment who'd been trained at Moore, and to have a college that was deeply devoted to good theological rigour. And I think one of the real strengths was actually biblical theology. And again, going back, the bigger narrative and story.
Yeah.
So, biblical theology isn't just about connecting to that big picture narrative, but it's actually about tracing concepts all the way through. And studying there, now it was a very different theological stream than I'd studied at in Bible college. Again, two very chalk and cheese things. But it made me both hungry for understanding things like the Gospels. My New Testament lecturer in the Gospels, a guy by the name of Alan Chappell, he just really brought the Gospels alive. And I think John, the Apostle John's writings in the Scriptures was something that appealed to my imagination, but at college, that just like went into overdrive.
Right.
And it sparked a lifelong work of making my way through John's writings and his theology. And I think, some gospel people might say I'm a synoptics guy or I'm a Johannine guy. I'm definitely in that Johannine. Yeah. I don't get me wrong. Very much love Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Matthew, Mark and Luke.
I've heard you've ripped them out of your Bible. Sorry. You love John though.
Yeah. And the other thing I think that was really helpful at college was I was one of the students that absolutely really loved and engaged in church history.
Okay.
We were talking before because one of the reasons Ethan's not here today is he's studying church history at college, and mentioned two types of students: those who, at the end of doing church history, go, "Phew, I'm glad that's over," and those who then quote, from all of the church fathers and others. And I was definitely in that later camp, and I really suspect that Ethan's going to be in that later camp.
Oh, possible. Well. I think that's highly possible.
But here is a story. The household of God, the people of faith, that story is just not just about our present moment, but it's had a historical, it's rooted in history. The message of the gospel's been passed on from the apostles through us. And when we engage in church history, we engage in that wider story. And the thing is that there are both powerfully and wonderfully good times and beautiful things in that church history, but also, things that go and remind us that without Jesus, left to our own devices, even the church can do some horrendous and horrible things. John Dixon says so well in his writings, we're both bullies and saints at the same time. But recognizing that doesn't actually end up I don't think should result in making us discouraged. What it should do, and when we push into it, is it just highlights our own need for the gospel, for Jesus. If we're not shaped by him and we're endeavoring to do things in our own power, well, then maybe things of fear of what other people are saying, fear of how we might be perceived, fear of how maybe the community around us might perceive us, then shape the way that we do things. If we have certain powers that come with that, we may be shaped more by those things rather than the power of the gospel, which sets us free.
Yeah. Wow, that's really cool. And then so you obviously got the job at Revesby, because how long have you been there as a pastor?
So March 25, 2012. So this coming March will mark my coming into my 14th year.
Okay,
yeah.
Wow. Yeah. And tell you, how has God shaped you over that time? So that's obviously a long time that we can't go into year by year detail.
So two key things. One has been the funeral ministry, which we kind of sort of touched on. Yep. Not something that I came to Revesby with a lot of experience, but have found God shaped and used me in that. But the second thing has been when we gather together, what is the structure of what happens when we gather together? What's its purpose of gathering together? So anyone that's done theological studies training to be a pastor, the emphasis in most of our theological streams is around the preaching and proclamation of the word, which is definitely something vast importance in that. What my time at Revesby taught me was that is but one thing of the gathering, and we can make it the one thing and diminish the other things that go along aside of it. And often we actually do that to the detriment of the one thing that we're trying to do well. And I'll explain it this way. So when I came to Revesby, I came from a church environment where services were led by other people, and the pastor, he got up to preach. And if you were down for service leading, you were getting, the service and the context ready for the minister to be able to preach or speak, or the speaker of the day. And I came to Revesby thinking there's got to be a roster of service leaders and others to do this. And when I asked for the upcoming Good Friday service, can I see the roster? Who's down? I was told, we don't have a roster. Our expectation is that the minister will lead the service.
Okay.
Now, I certainly had plenty of experience at leading a service. That was not the problem. But what was unique and new to me was the idea that not only was I going to be thinking just about the sermon, I was going to have to be thinking about hymn selection, songs, prayers, readings and other bits. And as I thought about how do I do that with regularity without kind of just being like, feeling like I'm being repetitious every week, going through the same sort of standards and stories and things, I wondered, what is the purpose of all this? We might talk about a church service which is called the 3 hymn sandwich or 3 song sandwich. Or could I call it maybe the song entree followed by the sermon meal, if I'm going to use a Soulies example there and things. So you have your singing time, and then we get into the sermon, and is one the warm-up act or preparation for the other. And that was probably where I was at naively when I came to Revesby. And as I kind of thought about, what are the elements here that make up that? I interestingly came across a book by Brian Chappell. And Brian Chappell does Christ-centered preaching, making Jesus the center of our preaching. And he'd written a book on Christ-centered worship, along a great book. One also, there's another by Michael Horton as well. And the thesis of Christ-centered worship is that the worship that happens, the other elements of our worship service, are all about telling that redemptive story. So when we actually look back at what Christians have done throughout church history when they've gathered together, the preaching of the word has been an important part of that, but these other elements have told that grand redemptive story. And the service itself can be a way of telling the gospel every time we meet. When we come and begin with something like a call to worship, we enter and realize that we are engaging with the God of the universe who made us, who's holy, who's beyond ourselves, not in comprehension, but just to fully kind of understand who he is in all of his enormity. The wonder, the awesomeness, not the awesome that we might use when we say, oh, that's an awesome skating trick and stuff, but genuine kind of awe and reverence, the one whom the wind and the waves are commanded by. When we begin with that, we can then go through this reorientation. And when you look at say, for example, the Psalms often have this aspect of coming in wonder, seeing ourselves then truly as we are before God, and then being reorientated by that. And so having a service that goes through that flow of the awesomeness of God, reverence, but then realizing who we are, having a prayer of confession, realizing that we can only come to God on his terms, being reorientated through the reading of his word, being reorientated through the visual gospel picture when we gather together. And some churches do this weekly and some churches do it monthly, but I think it needs to be done with regularity, which is, partaking of the Lord's Supper and communion. We're hearing the gospel in those elements and then being shaped by God's word as we hear it preached and proclaimed. And so realizing those things, that was a very, very formative thing. I've mentioned that in the previous podcast that my granny used to take us to a prayer book service when I was about 6 or 7, and we used to, play church by doing sort of prayer book.
Yeah.
And the irony for me is quite funny. God's sense of humour. I think I've become more liturgical in that way and shaped by that, and than I was sort of previously. And I hope, and I keep saying to myself, Michael, remember, don't be liturgical just for liturgy's sake. Liturgical because, or what you're doing, make it be shaped by declaring the gospel message. Because definitely we can pendulum swing, can't we? We can go to the other extreme, which is kind of like these things must happen in this way, in this order.
Yeah.
I remember it was, I think it was David Peterson at Moore College when I did a subject that was all about Anglican liturgies and forms of worship, and we spent a lot of time in the prayer book, obviously, that Cranmer had put together and how that shapes. And that was one of the things that came alive to me when we study the Anglican formularies and ways of doing church. It is telling the gospel story, and it's exactly what you said. You start with high praise, then you realise, well, if God is that big and here I am, all I can do in response to that is confess. But then I'm reassured, and knowing that I'm now in right relationship with God, I can come to his word and ready to listen to him and have it expounded, and then go out to love and serve God. And so, that kind of that story element is alive in my mind as well whenever I think about preparing a service and how those different elements fit together. And I love that it's part of our heritage that we tell the gospel story every week.
And that even relates even to the songs as well. I mean, sometimes in our singing, we can want to try and make the singing of our songs reorientating. We want to sing a song with joyfulness and upbeatness, and thinking that if we sing it joyfully, we will then be a recipient of that joy in our heart. We'll have that sort of happiness. But we're trying to then manufacture it, and it's only fleeting. It'll only be there for as long as maybe the song sort of rings. However, if you start with the story of who God is and then realise who you are, confess, real joy then comes out of thankfulness. He rescued me. He did this. And so then when we sing those songs in light of that, I think they actually become more powerful than if they're just sort of sung in kind of isolation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. I think maybe one caveat, maybe, or I don't know, it's not quite a pushback, but is the way we can use music to shape our emotions. So sometimes we use music to reflect what we're already feeling. And sometimes we can use music to, manufacture sounds like it's false, but it's actually like a God-given part of our characteristic, that music is naturally emotive. And therefore we can use music and song to enter into what I know I want to be praiseworthy here. I'm not feeling it yet, but I can be using music to, in the God-givenness of what music does to the body, mind and soul, to enter into those moments as well.
Yeah, and I think we'd be in agreement there. Definitely a very powerful part of who we are is our emotions.
Yes.
As human beings, God has created us with emotions. The nature of the triune God, the love that the Father has for the Son, the Son has for the Father, the Spirit and love to the Father and the Son, that deeply shapes us. And the reason we're called to love God and love our neighbour as ourselves is because that's a representation, or that's an outworking of what it is for us to be created in the image of God. Again, the thing is, pendulum swinging is probably a good thing, a good way of illustrating it, I should say, in that we can overcorrect, can't we? We can see, if we look back through church history, we can see times when emotionalism took a much greater part in certain gatherings of people, and sometimes to the detriment of people really deeply understanding.
Yes.
But then a counterness to that is to have a service and a gathering that is so structured and intellectual that removes any ability to have any emotion,
Yes.
that any kind of humanness has kind of come out of it as well.
Yeah. And we've seen that a little bit in the sort of those who are less charismatic reacting to the charismatic movement and going, oh, we see deficits there. We don't want to do that. So therefore we'll strip any form of emotion and emotive expression out of our singing or services because we don't want to go to that excess. And you can end up with some really dry songs and some really dry services. It's just like, oh, goodness, this feels like a drag. It's like, no, God. Yeah, so again, somewhere in that middle of the swing is being able to be fully alive cognitively of what's going on and to be able to express that importantly in our emotions.
Yeah.
No, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
I also know you're the bigwig of the FCC.
Yeah.
Is that right? What's the actual title? Sorry.
President of the Fellowship.
Of the Fellowship of Congregational Churches.
Yeah.
So how did that come about?
Well, so we're a small denomination, and again, depending on which of the Congregationalists you kind of talk to, you might find historically some of us could be maybe, how would I put this? When I think of the story of forming of Congregationalism, it often comes back to a pivotal event in 1662, known as the Act of Uniformity. And essentially the church and the government of the day in Britain basically said, if ministers want to want to take their role within the church, they need to conform to a prayer book service. And you can imagine what that may have done. And the non-conformist tradition that I'm a part of has kind of a number of streams, which can really be either one end or the other. One is there's a lot that we value in the prayer book, and we see as gospel and good. There are just a few little things that we just maybe, and conscience can't do. And some of that was really around extemporary prayer, the idea that speaking publicly in the service and praying in the service was something that was a conversation between the prayer and God, and to have written words out there to follow just couldn't be reconciled. It couldn't be something that someone could conform themselves to. And then, of course, I think you have within our tradition the other kind of group of people who just want to do their own thing and don't want to be told. I love people who are stubbornly principled. I might not agree with their principles, but I can actually understand that they would stand for a particular principle. But you can also find that there are people who are just principally stubborn as well, don't want to do whatever. And so the nonconformist tradition has that there within that. And so as I sort of think about my role then as president of FCC, and as having been someone who's kind of gone, because some of my traditions throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. Because some of what we do by seeking to be authentic, be true, be pure to what we're doing, can we also engage in a kind of novelty and searching for doing things differently just for the sake of doing things differently? And God's word, I believe, shows and shapes us and tells us that, God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. There is a consistency to who he is, an unchangeableness there of his character. But he is also, in the various stories of our human life, able to interact where we're at. He is able to enter into where we are. That's the beauty of the gospel. Jesus doesn't come into this world just because we're ready and primed for him to come. He comes because in God's story, now's the time. And as Paul writes, while we were yet far from him, he came into this world. And so we've got to allow those two diagonalizations to sort of happen. So going then to what does it mean for my role as president? This is a kind of question that you asked. It means that I came into the role going, or I came to the role going, we have a strong value on the local church. And sometimes we have such a strong value on the local church that we can miss out on good things that God would want us to do as part of the broader and wider church. Congregationalists believe strongly in the togetherness, the shared life, that the household is not just one person ruling the household and telling the household what to do, but a combined effort of everybody. And if as individual local churches, part of a wider body, we were just carrying on doing our own thing, I think we were actually working potentially against something good that God might have us through partnership with one another, but also something good about the universal church, which calls us to. And so my role as president, or my coming into that role as president, was saying Revesby's ministry is going to be stronger if it's going to be part of a healthy body and group of people around us, having healthier structures there within the churches. And it wasn't something, I kind of sought out and desired. Someone actually asked me a few years before, would I consider putting my hand up for the role? And I said, I actually don't feel like I can do it. And then basically what happened was I said no. And 2 years later, in 2019, there was a vacancy and no one else was going to do it. And I was like, if I'm going to still be in the what we call the executive, the body that leads the congregational churches, if I was still going to be a part of that and yet not have the role but functionally be the person asked to do it, do I not want to do that with the title, or should I do it with the title? And so in 2019, I agreed to it, and I thought, right, all right, here's my plans. Here's where I think we should kind of go. And then, of course, 2020 happened, how all those things that we were kind of thinking about just dramatically kind of changed. And so one thing I've been learning in my role as president has been that we can have a plan and a story, but God can often move us in different directions and shape that. We call each other to the unchangeableness of who God is. We call each other to make sure that we are faithful to the core tenets that are there. But we also allow good gospel freedom to be able, and generosity to each other, to be able to outwork the gospel in those areas.
So it's a pretty big role.
It is, yeah.
To think about that. What do you see as the future? What are you looking forward to in the future for the FCC and also for your church, Revesby?
I would say that I am looking for a future in which something of the beauty of what the church is, as described in Acts chapter 2, coming together, the proclamation, prayer, the sharing of life together, the genuine change that happened because of an encounter with the resurrected Jesus might be seen in the life of both the local church, Revesby, but also in the wider church. And a theological question that many people have when they come to that passage there in Acts, Acts chapter 2, 42 to 47, is this prescriptive of what the church is to do, or is it descriptive of the church? Yeah. And I would say that there are lots and lots of descriptions, lots of images that are used of the church, household, which we've touched on, family, temple, people of God, the bride, there's actually, I think, interestingly, probably more images used of the church in the New Testament than there are images of the gospel. We probably calculate that there's probably about 20 or so different images: atonement, redemption, propitiation, so on, used in terms of the gospel. But there's actually probably about 90 used in terms of the church.
Right.
Some like what you might sort of say from Revelation, lambs who reign, lambs who rule. They're images that often describe something that we kind of long for.
Mm.
And so herein lies one of the things. I long for the earthly church to be more representative of what the church in heaven is going to be like.
Right.
That's my wish and desire. And I know that if left to my imagination and I have a vision of what the earthly church should be like now, I'm probably going to be disappointed. I'm going to be disappointed in myself, and I'm going to be disappointed in others that we're not going to be able to do that because we're human. We're ones who will give ourselves over at times to our own desires. We won't be shaped always by that description. But if we can be closer to that every day, we can be one step further along. That's a beautiful thing. And it fundamentally keeps coming back down to retelling that story. I'm loved by God. I belong to his family. I was once apart from him. And this is where that picture of adoption for me rings really powerfully. I was without belonging, but now I have belonging. Yeah. And regardless of whether my story is like the prodigal son, the younger son that kind of goes, hey, God, Father, let me go. I want it now. Let's go. And then he comes back and he realizes, I'm better being a servant. I can't call upon you as Father, but then the Father welcomes him in. Or whether we be like the elder son, who always had that belonging there, but doesn't want to enter the household except on his own terms. I mean, that's the real sad thing there in the prodigal son story, is that Jesus is actually speaking to the Pharisees and the rulers around and saying, this is what you're like. God's redemptive plan has arrived, but you want to stand outside of it. And the sad thing is when the church is anything but what the church should be, when it hasn't in its life, in its community, grasped the gospel and let it shape its practice and its doing, where it's made things of our community, of that household, become more important than God shaping upon us. Does that make sense, that bit there? Yeah.
No, I think it's a great vision to have.
Yeah.
Try and make the earthly church more like the vision, or what God will have for us in heaven. I mean, that's the point of sanctification, isn't it? It's that we'll continue to be more like God every day. So I can appreciate that.
Yeah.
Just before we ask the last question, though, I want to ask you about your family.
Yep.
Tell us about your family, because I don't think we've talked much in detail about who makes up your family.
Oh, so in my family, there's Amanda, my wife, my two daughters, Kezia, who's turning 20 this year. I can't believe I've got an adult daughter.
Yeah.
And Lucy, she's 16, year 11 this year. We have two dogs, 4 chickens, a cat, a menagerie of animals. That family unit, when God sometimes brings me to a pause moment, when God has me to look around at that family, it is absolutely something beautiful and wondrous.
Yeah.
I'd say that the person who has most influenced my life apart from Jesus is my wife, Amanda. Coming together as a young couple, getting married in our 20s, there is many things we've gone through life together at very formative stages, and there's a beauty I can see about in that relationship, an intimacy that is imperfect but yet still points to what it is for us as a church. Kezia is our bubble of joy in our family, and a huge delight, and very much like me. And Lucy is very much like her mum, but engages in some really great conversations as well. I thought about this the other day. When Lucy was born, I kind of struggled with, would I have love, the same kind of love for a second child as I had for my first? And I realised that I was thinking about love as if it was just a quantifying, like, you had this resource, as in like water, and so now I've got to disperse this amount of water to this person, to this person. Yeah. But love actually comes up from within us. It's more the tap than it is the glass and the cup of water. And when we are, as a Christian, believe shaped by God's love, that love is then able to both be something that we're able to show to one person and to another person, without any kind of change in sort of flow or quantity and things as well. The other interesting thing is that I thought, I had 2 daughters. I probably longed for a son. I probably longed for a kid that I would be going out camping with and all this kind of stuff. And yet I'm just blown away by the blessing of the small family unit, the bond that we have. When I stop in my busyness, I just find it incredible to hang out with them, to have the conversations, to be around them. And I think maybe that's come out of, lots of car drives, taking them to and from school, sitting there and picking them up at various different things. That's been a privilege that flexible ministry hours have allowed me to be around more in the day-to-day life and things. I'm just, the connection there with the family has just been a real blessing.
I love hearing that, because I think, and Tim, you probably agree with this too, but the longer I'm a father, the more I'm like, oh, this is what I was meant to do. And I think that's what's really cool about it. I hear you saying that too. It's, it's a massive blessing. That I'm so blessed to be able to have. I have 3 kids, and you just like, they're so different, yet they give you so much, and you can't. You don't have to disperse the love resource. It's very easy to know that you love them all exactly the same. So it makes a lot of sense. It's really, really cool. Final question. We've talked over 2 podcasts now about your life. What would be the thing that you would like to go back in time and tell your younger Christian self?
The one thing.
So many things.
So many things. Don't drink Coke.
Or so much anyway.
So much of it and stuff. Yeah. Touching on, if I was going to summarize it this way, the family, the household, has brought me joy. And when I think about the beautiful things that I've experienced in church life, it's joy that I keep coming back to.
Yeah.
And interestingly, even in times of struggle and suffering and difficulty, God's gift in that has been not immediately, not instantaneously, but as the gospel has kind of shaped my thinking and work, as I've kind of looked at it looked at God's story, looked at what the Bible teaches, looked at what Jesus is saying, and then related that to some sort of circumstance and situation, it's been reorientating, and it's brought me a joy, whether it's realizing that, you know, I can feel a sense of wanting to bring my own belonging and merit and value based on the things that I do. But the gospel reorientates me and says my merit is based on what Jesus has done for me. And I experience the Father's pleasure because I am part of his family.
Yeah.
The joy that I experience when I see my daughters growing in their faith and living it out and put it in practice is a kind of joy that the Father feels for us when we do the same in our household of faith. I think I'd go back to my younger self and say, spend more time chasing that joy rather than chasing the fleeting things that are around. Because at the end of a person's life, people don't say in the gatherings and the funerals that I do, they don't say terribly much about, you know, like what a person accomplished in their life. That's kind of the background material for who the person is.
Yeah.
And being a father has made me realise, both of us have gone through my journey of fatherhood, and as I've seen what is sort of said, the biggest impact is in the relationships that you have. You know, when you finish work, your family is still going to be there, but your workplace is going to be gone. If your identity is in your workplace, or if your identity is in your ministry, or if your identity is in the life of the church, or if your identity is in these kinds of accomplishments, well, they'll go. But there will be other things that will carry and continue on. And so if I was to say to my younger self, who I think actually probably got at times this aspect of joy better than my sort of middle-aged self, and who Michael, now coming into his 50s, is seeing and rediscovering, I'd say, you know, yeah, don't let those other things rob you there of that joy. Yeah. Don't let what others might think about you, you know, sort of rob you. You're loved by God. Make my joy complete. Follow that same attitude of Jesus. And when you do that, you know, service to others becomes actually joyful.
Yeah.
It doesn't become, you know, something that's, you know, I'm just doing this until, you know. I'd say to my younger self, pursue that kind of joy.
Yeah, that's cool. Pursue that kind of joy. I like that. Well, it's been a pleasure, Michael. Thank you very much. It's been really cool to have you, first of all, take the time to do 2 podcasts. Yeah. But also, I really enjoyed the way that kind of all fell into place today about talking about Biggles, obviously, but then about how that fits into God's story and using other stories to see, put like the greater beauty of God's story as well. So I think that's really, but I think I also just want to say, I really like the way that you articulate yourself, and you've obviously thought deeply about a lot of things that you've spoken about today. But there's throughout all of that, there is a level of humility, but also confidence. And I think it is because of God's story. So you're humble under God in doing what you do, but also with the confidence to know that He has shaped your story, regardless. So that's what we're talking about today. So thank you very much.
No, thank you. It's been enjoyable. That's good. Fun. It's good to have a laugh as well.
Yeah.
And, you know, have that silliness as well. Yeah. And no, thank you. Good pleasure.
It's been great. Tim, as guest host, anything else you would like to contribute to the end of the podcast?
Thanks for having me as a guest
You're
host.
welcome.
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you.
By
Michael.
the child of God's church. Is that all you're going to say?
Many good bookseller.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. But anything else?
No.
No.
Sorry.
Well, that's no. You don't need to apologise. I just wanted to check because I'm going to wrap it up now. As we say, wrap up the chips. Going to wrap up the chips. It's been, like I said, a pleasure. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, Tim. And thank you to everyone listening and watching. You've been listening or watching the Chip Lunch podcast, and we'll be back with another episode next week where we hear about more stories of Jesus changing everything. But for now, we're going to finish with a one way.
One way.